The air in the business-class cabin of Flight 815 to Washington, D.C. was a carefully curated blend of recycled oxygen and quiet entitlement. It smelled of expensive leather, floral perfume, and the faint, metallic tang of ambition. Crystal glasses clinked softly, conversations were kept to a low, confident murmur, and the world outside the double-paned windows was a blur of distant, insignificant ground. Into this hermetically sealed bubble of privilege stepped Alara Vance. She was an anomaly, a glitch in the cabin's polished matrix. Her presence was quiet but dissonant, like a scuffed note in a perfect symphony. She wore a faded charcoal gray hoodie, the cuffs frayed from years of unconscious worry, and a pair of jeans that bore a small, honest tear at the knee. Her dark, wavy hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, revealing a face devoid of makeup, etched with a tiredness that seemed older than her years. On her back, she carried an old army green backpack, a relic from another life, its fabric softened with wear. Heads turned. They always did. Lorraine Adler, the head flight attendant, was the first to intercept her. A woman in her late 40s, Lorraine's uniform was starched to perfection, her smile a thin, precise line drawn across her face. Her eyes, sharp and quick, performed a familiar calculus, assessing Alara's worth in less than a second and finding it wanting. "Your boarding pass, please," Lorraine said, her voice smooth but with an undercurrent of steel. Alara handed it over. Lorraine glanced at the seat number 12 ferret and then back at Alara, her smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "I see. Economy is full, so it seems you've gotten lucky today. Your seat is this way." The emphasis on lucky was just sharp enough to draw a soft chuckle from a man in the adjacent row. Alara said nothing. She simply nodded and moved down the narrow aisle, her steps careful not to brush against the gleaming Rimowa carry-ons and leather briefcases that lined the path like polished trophies. From seat 10C, Preston Thorne watched her pass, a man who wore his success like a second skin, from his perfectly knotted silk tie to the heavy gold watch on his wrist that screamed new money. He leaned toward his seatmate. "Looks like she got lost on her way to the bus station," he murmured, just loud enough to be an announcement. Alara's shoulders didn't tense. Her pace didn't falter. Her eyes remained fixed on the row numbers above, her expression a mask of placid neutrality. She had learned long ago that reacting to such barbs only gave them power. A woman across the aisle, Bryn Calloway, glanced up from her phone. Her nails were a glossy, predatory red, and her lips curled into a quick, dismissive smirk before she returned to scrolling through a feed of curated perfection. She was an influencer, a purveyor of aspirational lifestyles, and Alara was the antithesis of everything she sold. Finally reaching 12 ferret, Alara slid into the window seat. She tucked her worn backpack under the seat in front of her, her movements economical and precise. A small, faded patch of an eagle, wings outstretched, was visible for a moment before it disappeared into the shadows. The man next to her, who she now recognized as Preston Thorne, gave her a deliberate once-over, his gaze lingering on her scuffed sneakers before he turned back to his tablet. His cologne was a heavy, cloying fog of sandalwood and arrogance. Alara settled in, her fingers finding the familiar, worn texture of her hoodie sleeves. She didn't need to prove anything. She wasn't here for them. She just needed to get to DC. She leaned her head against the cool plastic of the window frame and watched the ground crew move like ants below. The world of men in sharp suits and women with sharper smirks faded into the low, steady hum of the aircraft, a sound that, for her, had always been a strange kind of lullaby. She was an island of calm in a sea of quiet contempt, and she was perfectly content to be left alone. As the plane ascended, breaking through a thick blanket of clouds into the blinding, empty blue of the stratosphere, the cabin settled into its established rhythm. The soft ballet of service began, orchestrated by Lorraine Adler with military precision. The first jab came wrapped in professional courtesy. When the meal service began, Lorraine paused by Rachel's row, her cart laden with porcelain dishes and linen napkins. She offered a menu to Preston Thorne with a warm, deferential smile. "Mr. Thorne, will it be the filet or the salmon today?" Then, she turned her gaze to Alara. The warmth vanished, replaced by a cool, dismissive professionalism. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet cabin. "We only have enough of the premium meals for our designated business-class passengers." Her eyes flicked pointedly at Alara's hoodie. "I can get you a bottle of water." A low, mocking laugh came from a few rows ahead. Sterling Finch, a portly executive with a booming voice and a loosened tie, turned in his seat. "Don't worry, Lorraine. I'm sure she's used to fast food." A ripple of condescending chuckles spread through the front of the cabin. Alara's hand, which had been resting on her knee, stilled for a fraction of a second. She slowly looked up, her dark, unreadable eyes meeting Lorraine's for a brief, intense moment. "Water is fine," she said. Her voice was quiet but firm, carrying a weight that seemed disproportionate to the simple words. It wasn't a request, it was a statement. A line drawn in the sand. Lorraine blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the sheer steadiness in Alara's gaze. She recovered quickly, forcing her tight smile back into place before moving on, her heels clicking against the floor with a little more force than before. Hours crawled by, marked by the clinking of glasses and the low hum of self-important conversations. Alara sipped her water, her movements spare and deliberate, like someone trained to conserve energy under pressure. She felt Preston Thorne's gaze on her periodically, a mixture of curiosity and disdain. He couldn't reconcile her presence with his rigid worldview. Finally, his condescension got the better of his restraint. "So," he began, leaning slightly into her space, his voice thick with faux friendliness. "Headed to a job interview or something? Hope you've got a better outfit in that bag." He gestured with his chin toward her backpack. Alara turned her head slowly, just enough to meet his eyes. Her expression was neutral, yet her gaze was so direct it was disarming. "I'm good," she said, her voice a low, steady blade that slid cleanly through his smugness. Preston blinked, thrown off by her lack of deference or embarrassment. He had expected her to stammer, to explain herself, to shrink under his judgment. Instead, she had simply deflected him, rendering his comment powerless. He grunted, muttering something about kids these days, and retreated back to the glowing screen of his tablet, a faint flush creeping up his neck. Across the aisle, Bryn Calloway was whispering to her friend, another woman draped in a silk scarf that probably cost more than Alara's entire wardrobe. "Bet she's terrified of flying. She hasn't moved a muscle since we took off," Bryn said, her smirk sharp enough to cut glass. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched Alara's lips, but she didn't turn her head. She just reached for her water bottle, unscrewing the cap with a slow, deliberate twist. The quiet sound seemed to echo in the cabin. She was an observer, a ghost in their machine, and her refusal to engage in their petty dramas was, in itself, a form of defiance they couldn't comprehend. She let their judgments wash over her, as insignificant as the passing clouds outside her window. She had faced real threats, real danger. This was just noise. The monotony of the flight, the drone of the engines, the recycled air, the persistent hum of quiet conversation was abruptly broken by a crackle from the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." The voice was calm, but the unexpectedness of it caused a few heads to lift. "We're experiencing a minor issue with one of our fuel gauges. As a precaution, we will be making a brief, unscheduled stop at Andrews Air Force Base for a quick check and refueling. We apologize for the inconvenience and anticipate only a short delay." A collective groan rippled through the business class cabin. Preston Thorne sighed dramatically, tapping his expensive watch. "Unbelievable. I have a meeting at the Pentagon at 4. Sterling Finch grumbled loudly to his neighbor about airline incompetence. Bryn Calloway rolled her eyes and began typing furiously into her phone, likely crafting a post about her travel nightmare. But Alara Vance had a different reaction. At the mention of Andrews Air Force Base, her entire posture shifted. It was a subtle change, almost imperceptible, but profound. Her head, which had been resting against the window, lifted. Her spine straightened. Her eyes, which had been soft and distant, sharpened with an intensity that hadn't been there before. She leaned closer to the window, her gaze sweeping over the landscape as the plane began its descent. Soon, the sprawling, orderly layout of the military base came into view. Her eyes traced the long, clean lines of the runways. She saw hangars, vast and imposing, and below, the unmistakable, predatory shapes of fighter jets parked in perfect formation. F-22 Raptors. Their sleek, gray bodies glinted under the afternoon sun, looking like lethal birds of prey at rest. Her hand, which had been resting loosely in her lap, clenched into a fist for a single, tight second before she consciously relaxed it. She set her water bottle down in the seat back pocket, her movements now imbued with a new, focused energy. Lorraine Adler, standing nearby while securing the service cart, noticed the change in Alara's demeanor. Her professional suspicion was piqued. "Something catch your eye?" she asked, her tone dripping with a condescending curiosity, as if Alara were a child mesmerized by big, shiny toys. Alara didn't answer right away. She just kept looking out the window, her expression unreadable, as if she were seeing something no one else could, a memory, a feeling, a piece of a life they couldn't possibly imagine. As the plane banked for its final approach, Sterling Finch, ever the loudest voice in the room, leaned over his seat. "What, you thinking of flying one of those things?" he called out, his laugh sharp and mean. A few of his peers chuckled along with him. Alara turned her head slowly, her dark eyes locking onto his. The placid neutrality was gone, replaced by a calm, unwavering firmness. "I've worked near planes before," she said. Her voice was still quiet, but it carried the finality of a heavy door clicking shut. Sterling's grin faltered. He shifted in his seat, suddenly finding his half-empty glass of whiskey intensely interesting. Lorraine raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow but said nothing more. The cabin grew quieter, the air thick with an unspoken tension. The plane had diverted from its course, and in doing so, it felt as though it had diverted from their world into hers. The ground was coming up to meet them, and with it, a reckoning they never saw coming. The aircraft touched down on the military runway with a smoothness that spoke of the pilot's skill, but the passengers of Flight 815 were too busy processing the disruption to notice. Once the plane taxied to a halt in a designated civilian area, the seatbelt sign pinged off. The business class passengers, eager to reassert their importance, began checking their phones and adjusting their jackets. Lorraine's crisp voice came over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate your patience. During our brief stop, a few of our passengers have been invited for a special tour to meet with the F-22 pilots on the tarmac. Please remain seated unless you have been personally notified." As she spoke, her eyes flicked almost involuntarily toward Alara, a silent confirmation that she was, of course, not on the list. Preston Thorne puffed out his chest. He was on the board of a major defense contractor. Naturally, he was on the list. Bryn Calloway whispered to her friend, her voice loud enough to carry, "They probably don't want pictures with someone dressed like that anyway." Alara didn't move. She just took another sip of water, her face as blank as a calm sea. She had heard it all before. Just as the invited guests began to gather their things, the cabin door opened. A man in a flight suit, adorned with the rank of a major, stepped inside. He was in his late 30s, with a jawline that looked carved from granite and eyes that missed nothing. His presence was a stark contrast to the soft luxury of the cabin. He was a storm front rolling into a garden party. This was Major Declan Reese. He greeted the invited passengers, Preston Thorne, a few other executives, with a polite but distant nod. He shook Preston's hand, his grip firm and professional. But then, as his gaze swept the cabin, it landed on the quiet woman in the faded hoodie sitting in seat 12 Farad. He froze. His hand was still gripping Preston's, but his attention was entirely elsewhere. The polite mask dropped from his face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock, which quickly morphed into something else: reverence. The cabin didn't notice at first, but Alara did. She met his gaze across the aisle, her expression steady, as if she'd been expecting this moment all along. Her fingers brushed the edge of her seat, a small, grounding motion. Major Reese slowly released Preston's hand, his apology a distracted murmur. He walked straight to her row, his boots making a heavy, authoritative sound against the carpeted floor. The low buzz of conversation in the cabin died down as all eyes followed him. He stopped directly in front of her, standing at attention in the narrow aisle. He ignored Preston Thorne completely. His focus was solely on Alara. "Ma'am," he began, his voice low but resonant, filled with a respect that bordered on awe. "My apologies for the intrusion, but are you Nick's phantom?" The name hung in the air, alien and powerful. Preston Thorne let out a soft snort, a sound of disbelief. A joke, he thought, some kind of prank. Alara gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, her eyes never leaving the Major's. A muscle in Reese's jaw tightened. He turned his head slightly, and his voice was suddenly louder, clearer, projecting through the stunned silence of the entire cabin. "My deepest apologies for having you sit back here, ma'am," he declared. "You are invited to the tarmac, immediately." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dense, heavy thing, broken only by the faint hum of the plane's auxiliary power. Slowly, Ilara Vance stood up. She slung her old backpack over one shoulder, her movements smooth and economical. She didn't look at Preston Thorne, whose face had gone slack with confusion. She didn't look at Lorraine Adler, whose perfect smile had vanished, replaced by a mask of horrified disbelief. She didn't look at anyone. As she followed Major Reese toward the open door, a man in a navy suit leaned out of his seat. "This has to be some kind of mistake," he said loudly, his voice filled with the confident bluster of a man used to being in charge. "She doesn't look like anyone important." Ilara's steps didn't falter, but her hand tightened on her backpack strap, her knuckles whitening for a moment. She turned her head slightly, her gaze meeting his. "Looks can be deceiving," she said. Her voice was soft, but it cut through the cabin like a blade through silk. The man's mouth opened, then closed. He sank back into his seat, his confidence suddenly deflated. Major Reese shot him a look that was colder than a winter sky before leading Ilara out of the cabin and into the sharp, windswept air of the tarmac. She left behind a plane full of people whose perfectly ordered world had just been shattered. The moment Ilara stepped out of the climate-controlled cabin, the world shifted. The air was sharp with the scent of jet fuel and the raw, clean smell of wind. It was a smell she knew better than any perfume. Her hoodie flapped around her, a stark contrast to the crisp, olive-drab flight suits of the men and women standing before her. Lined up in a perfect, unwavering row on the tarmac was an entire squadron of F-22 pilots. They stood at parade rest, their faces unreadable, their posture ramrod straight. They were the elite, the best of the best, and they were all looking at her. Major Declan Reese stood beside her, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind. "Attention," he barked. In a single, sharp motion, every pilot snapped to attention. The sound of their boots hitting the asphalt in perfect unison was like a crack of thunder. "On deck," Reese announced, his voice ringing with pride and deference, "is Nick's Phantom, the one who led Ghost, Spectre, and Wraith squadrons through enemy skies and brought them all home." As if pulled by a single string, every hand rose in a crisp, powerful salute. It was not a gesture of polite recognition. It was a profound display of respect, a tribute paid from one warrior to another. It was an honor reserved for legends. From the windows of Flight 815, the business-class passengers watched, their faces pale masks of astonishment pressed against the glass. Preston Thorne stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape. Lorraine Adler gripped the edge of a seat, her knuckles white. Bryn Calloway's phone lay forgotten in her lap. The world they knew, governed by wealth and status, had just collided with a world governed by courage and sacrifice, and theirs was found profoundly wanting. On the tarmac, Ilara returned the salute. Her movement was fluid and precise, an echo from a life she had tried to leave behind. A faint, warm smile touched her lips as she lowered her hand. For a moment, the weight of their judgment, the sting of their words, all of it dissolved into the vast open sky. Her shoulders, which had been subtly tensed, seemed to soften. She was home. Major Reese gave a signal, and a young officer stepped forward, carrying an old flight helmet with reverence. It was worn, its surface bearing the marks of countless hours in the sky, but it was immaculately kept. Embroidered in bold white letters across the side was the call sign, Nick's Phantom. Reese took the helmet and held it out to Ilara. "This helmet is only awarded to a pilot who has completed a top-secret Tier 1 mission and demonstrated unparalleled bravery," he said, his voice loud enough to carry, perhaps intentionally, toward the watching plane. Ilara took the helmet. Her fingers, calloused in ways no one on that plane could understand, traced the stitching for a moment. Then, with a practiced motion as natural as breathing, she slipped it on. It fit perfectly, like a piece of her that had been missing. A young pilot, barely out of his 20s, stepped forward from the line, his awe evident on his face. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, She's the one who saved my squadron over the Gulf." Another pilot, his face still boyish, approached hesitantly. He held a small, weathered logbook. "Ma'am," he began, his voice cracking slightly, "you signed this for me 3 years ago at Bagram." He opened it to a page marked with her call sign, her signature sharp and unmistakable beneath it. Ilara took the logbook, her fingers brushing the page. She looked at the young man, a genuine warmth filling her eyes. "You made it through, Lieutenant," she said, her voice quiet but firm. The pilot's eyes shone with unshed tears. He stepped back, saluting her again, a gesture of pure, unadulterated hero worship. The scene on the tarmac was a silent, powerful rebuke to every snide comment, every dismissive glance she had endured. Alara Vance, the woman in the faded hoodie, was not someone who had gotten lucky to be on their plane. They were the ones who were lucky to be breathing the same air as her. And now, they knew it. When Alara stepped back into the cabin, the helmet tucked under her arm, it was as if she had entered a different aircraft entirely. The air, once thick with arrogance, was now heavy with a stunned, deferential silence. The power dynamic had been irrevocably shattered and rebuilt. The passengers who had been so quick to judge now avoided her gaze, their faces a mixture of awe, embarrassment, and shame. Preston Thorne was staring intently at his tablet, though the screen was blank. Bryn Calloway was fussing with her silk scarf, her earlier confidence completely gone. Sterling Finch looked as though he wanted the floor to swallow him whole. Lorraine Adler approached, her professional smile now forced and brittle. "Well," she said, her voice overly polite and strained, "it's an honor to have such a special guest with us, Miss Vance." Her eyes, however, couldn't help but flick down to Alara's scuffed sneakers before quickly looking away. The habit of judgment died hard. As Alara settled back into 12 Farad, a younger flight attendant, her face flushed with genuine admiration, came to her row. She held out a small pin, a silver eagle with its wings spread wide. "This is from the crew, ma'am," she stammered, her voice stumbling over the words. "For, your service." The entire cabin watched the exchange. Alara looked at the pin, then at the young woman's earnest face. She took it, her fingers gentle, and without a word, pinned it to the strap of her old backpack. The simple act felt more significant than any medal ceremony. The attendant beamed, a real smile this time, and hurried back to her station. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their imminent departure. But before he could finish, another sound cut through the cabin, a low, powerful roar that vibrated through the fuselage. Everyone turned to the windows. On either side of the commercial airliner, 2 F-22 Raptors had materialized as if from thin air. They flew in perfect, impossibly close formation, their wings glinting in the sunlight. They were escorts. Then, a voice, crisp and clear, crackled over the cabin's radio frequency, patched through for everyone to hear. It was Major Declan Reese. "Nick's Phantom, we never got a chance to thank you properly for that business over the Black Sea. This is the least we could do." A flight attendant handed Alara a headset that had been plugged into the cockpit's comms. She put it on, a small smile playing on her lips. She leaned toward the window, her voice steady and calm, imbued with the quiet authority of command. "Hold formation, Eagle One, and thank you." The response came back instantly, a chorus of voices over the radio. "Yes, ma'am." The cabin went utterly, completely silent. No one spoke, no one moved. Richard Hale froze, his drink halfway to his mouth. Lorraine Adler's hands fumbled with a tray, dropping a napkin without noticing. The 2 fighter jets stayed locked to their wings as the plane climbed into the sky, a silent, thundering tribute to the unassuming woman in seat 12 Farad. As the plane leveled off, a passenger in a tailored jacket, his face red with embarrassment, unbuckled his seatbelt. It was the man who had loudly declared it must be a mistake. He walked to Alara's row, his hands fidgeting. I didn't know who you were," he stammered, his voice low but audible in the quiet cabin. "I'm sorry for what I said earlier. Deeply sorry." Alara looked up from the window. Her eyes were steady, but not unkind. She gave him a single, small nod of acknowledgement. It was all the absolution he would get. The man stood there for a moment longer before returning to his seat, humbled. The flight to DC felt shorter after that. The air was charged, the earlier chatter replaced by an uneasy respect. Alara kept her eyes on the window, watching her escort peel away as they began their final descent. 2 silver ghosts vanishing back into the endless blue. The landing at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport was smooth, but the disembarking process was stilted and awkward. As Alara stood to retrieve her things, the usual jostling for position at the front of the cabin was absent. People moved slowly, deliberately making way for her. She slung her backpack over her shoulder, the new silver eagle pin glinting in the cabin lights, and tucked the flight helmet under her other arm. She walked down the aisle, her steps steady, her head held high. Preston Thorne was already on his phone, his back turned to the aisle as he muttered something about a delayed meeting, actively avoiding her eyes. Bryn Calloway was typing furiously, her face pale, no doubt deleting her earlier snarky posts about the flight. At the exit, Lorraine Adler stood, her smile fixed and painful. "Have a wonderful day, Miss Vance," she managed, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Alara didn't look at her. She simply nodded and stepped out into the jet bridge. At the gate, a man was waiting. He was tall and quiet, with a presence that commanded attention without needing a single word. His suit was simple but exquisitely tailored, and his eyes, a calm, intelligent gray, locked onto Alara the moment she appeared. He didn't smile, but his entire posture seemed to soften at the sight of her. He was Julian Davenport, her husband, a man whose influence ran in the deep, silent currents of power that truly shaped the city. He fell into step beside her, taking her backpack without a word and slinging it over his own shoulder. The remaining passengers from the flight, lingering at the baggage claim entrance, saw him. They saw the way he looked at her, the quiet, unshakable bond between them. And for those in the know, they recognized him. Sterling Finch, the loud executive, dropped his phone mid-text, his bravado gone. No one needed to say his name. His presence was the final, unspoken confirmation of a world they had so badly misjudged. Before they left the terminal, a young girl, no older than 10, tugged at her mother's sleeve and pointed at Alara. "Mommy, is that the pilot lady?" she whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. The mother, a quiet woman who had stayed silent during the flight, looked at Alara, then at her daughter, and nodded. "That's her," she said softly, her voice filled with a simple, profound respect. Alara caught the girl's eye and gave a small, warm smile, the first truly open expression she had shown all day. The girl grinned back, her face radiant. The consequences for the others came quickly, but quietly, like a tide going out. A recording of Preston Thorne's comments, filmed by another passenger, went viral within hours. By the next morning, his position at the defense contracting firm was terminated, his LinkedIn profile scrubbed clean. Bryn Calloway's biggest sponsorship deal was canceled due to a morality clause in her contract. Lorraine Adler was formally reprimanded and reassigned to short-haul domestic routes, her dreams of prestigious international flights grounded indefinitely. Sterling Finch's consulting firm quietly dropped him from their roster, his name erased from their website by the end of the week. Alara never saw any of it unfold. She didn't need to. She had been through worse than their words, through skies filled with fire and missions where one wrong move meant never coming home. This was just noise, the kind of static she had learned to tune out long ago. She and Julian walked out into the crisp DC air, their steps in sync. The city skyline loomed before them, a reminder of why she was here, not for the passengers, not for the recognition, but for something bigger, something that had always driven her. The wind tugged at her faded hoodie, but she didn't pull it tighter. She just stood there, steady and solid, the flight helmet under her arm. The world had doubted her, mocked her, and tried to make her feel small. But she wasn't small. She never had been. She was Nick's phantom. And for a moment, looking at the city stretching out before her, she felt a quiet, unshakable peace. She was home.